They were the soldiers America didn't want. Men the army tried to hide, segregated, underestimated, pushed into labor instead of battle. But when World War I erupted, these same men stepped onto the front lines of Europe and became the most feared American unit of the entire war. German troops called them the Black Devils. The world would remember them as the Harlem Hellfighters. This is the true story of the regiment the U's doubted, the French trusted, and the enemy feared. The black soldiers who fought longer, harder, and with more courage than anyone expected, and changed American history forever. Long before the Hellfighters ever set foot on French soil. Before the trenches, before the bayonets, before the thunder of artillery shaped their legend. Their story began in a very different battlefield, the streets of America. In the early 1900s, Harlem was transforming. Waves of black families escaping the violence and poverty of the South were heading north in what would become known as the Great Migration. They came seeking jobs, dignity, safety. Harlem quickly became a place where art, music, and community thrived. It was a cultural heartbeat. But even in the North, racism wasn't gone. It simply wore different clothes, restrictive housing policies, job discrimination, segregated schools. Black men worked the toughest jobs for the lowest pay. And yet, Harlem was still a place where hope felt possible. When the United States joined World War I in 1917, many in Harlem saw something unusual, a chance. Service in uniform had historically been one of the few ways black Americans could prove themselves in a country that doubted them at every turn. Ministers preached that military service could elevate the race. Newspapers like The Crisis, run by W.E.B. Du Bois, encouraged young black men to enlist. If they fought for democracy abroad, perhaps democracy would finally come home. But America wasn't ready for that. Not yet. When these men volunteered, they discovered quickly that patriotism didn't shield them from prejudice. At recruiting offices, some were turned away simply because officers didn't want colored infantry. Others were accepted but assigned to labor battalions, where they shoveled coal or unloaded supplies instead of being trained as soldiers. The 5th New York National Guard Regiment, unit that would later become the 369th Infantry, was formed because black leaders in Harlem fought for it relentlessly. Community activists, church pastors, and politicians demanded that New York create a state guard unit for black men. But even once it existed, it faced obstacles. They had uniforms but no rifles, recruits but no training grounds, officers but very few who were allowed to be black, and funding? Barely enough to keep the doors open. Some white officers openly refused to command them. Others accepted the job but made their prejudices clear. One commander suggested the men did not have the discipline or intelligence for real combat. Comments like that weren't whispered, they were written into official reports. But still, Harlem's men came, dressed in patched clothes, some carrying their own shoes. They arrived at the armory, eager to prove something the country refused to believe about them. They drilled in empty lots, marched through snowstorms, and trained with broomsticks because rifles were scarce. Crowds sometimes gathered just to gawk at them, calling out slurs as they passed. Yet the men didn't break. They held their heads high. And with each step, each drill, each long march, they forged something more powerful than the Army ever expected: unity. By late 1917, they were finally federalized as the 369th Infantry Regiment. They boarded trains heading south for further training, certain they were one step closer to proving themselves. But the South in 1917 was a powder keg. The men of the 369th, many who had grown up in northern cities, suddenly found themselves in a world where racial hatred was enforced with violence. Signs reading "colored only" dictated every part of daily life. Some towns refused to let them march through the streets. Others gathered angry crowds to jeer at them. One night, a mob threatened to attack the regiment's camp, and the men had to be relocated for their safety. White troops stationed nearby made it clear they didn't want black soldiers around. Fights broke out. Complaints piled up. Military police watched them more closely than the enemy they were supposed to fight overseas. General Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, even issued a memo advising French officers not to treat Negro soldiers as equals, warning that doing so would ruin them. This policy, written at the highest level of command, followed the 369th all the way across the Atlantic when they shipped out in late 1917 and early 1918. The men of Harlem stepped onto crowded transport ships not knowing what to expect. The voyage was long, cramped, and dangerous. U-boat threats were constant. But every mile across the ocean was a mile further from the prejudice they knew, and a mile closer to the chance to finally fight. When they arrived in France, something unexpected happened. The French didn't look at them with fear or suspicion. There were no segregation signs, no sidelong stares. Instead, civilians greeted them warmly, curious about the new American soldiers with dark skin and confident posture. French officers evaluated them like any other unit, not through the lens of race, but through the lens of competence. And competence was something the 369th had in abundance, but the U.S. Army still refused to deploy them in combat. They were assigned to unload ships, dig ditches, and move supplies. The frustration was suffocating. These men had crossed an ocean to fight, and instead were being used as laborers. Then came a break no one could have predicted. The French army, depleted by years of war, urgently needed reinforcements. They requested additional American troops. The U.S. offered the Hellfighters not because they believed in them, but because they didn't want them fighting under American command. The French accepted immediately. America may not have wanted them as combat soldiers, but France welcomed them as brothers in arms. The 369th received French Adrian helmets, Lebel rifles, and French uniforms that fit awkwardly over their American-issued clothing. But once armed and trained in French tactics, everything changed. Life in the trenches wasn't just brutal, it was surreal. Mud so deep it swallowed your boots. The stench of decay clinging to every surface. Nights lit only by artillery flashes. The constant fear that the next breath might inhale poisonous gas. Letters home from the men described the front as a place where the earth shakes and the sky screams. But something strange happened. The Hellfighters adapted faster than anyone expected. They absorbed everything the French taught them: bayonet techniques, close quarters combat, night patrols. They volunteered for missions other units avoided. French commanders started requesting them by name. The first major test came in the Argonne Forest, a dense, dark battlefield where visibility dropped to almost nothing. The men advanced through undergrowth so thick they had to cut their way through with knives. German snipers hid in high branches. Mines were buried everywhere. The forest itself felt alive, like it resisted every step. The Hellfighters pressed forward anyway, and in that same forest, under the cover of night, the legend of Henry Johnson was born. His battle is often summarized, but the true scale of what happened is far worse and far more heroic than most people realize. Johnson wasn't just outnumbered. He and Roberts were facing a trained German raiding party intent on capturing prisoners. The Germans had grenades, rifles, clubs, and numerical advantage. Johnson had a jammed rifle, a few grenades, and a knife. He fought with the fury of a man who understood that surrender meant torture or death. Even after being wounded multiple times, he refused to fall back. His determination was so fierce that when he charged forward, the Germans believed more soldiers were coming. They fled, leaving behind weapons, footprints, and 2 dead raiders. Johnson saved his partner. He protected his unit. He held the line alone. News of his bravery spread through French newspapers within days. Civilians called him Black Death. French generals awarded him the Croix de Guerre. American newspapers mentioned him briefly, then dropped the story. Racism erased what should have been one of the greatest honors of the war. But the 369th didn't slow down. They pushed through Champagne, advancing under machine gun fire so intense it shredded entire trees. They fought in below wood among shattered trunks and splintered bark where every shadow might hide an enemy. They advanced through barbed wire, trenches filled with water to the waist, and roads turned to rivers of mud by constant shelling. During one assault, they captured nearly an entire German trench line, then held it under a counterattack that lasted hours. French units nearby reported that the Hellfighters fought as if possessed. What kept them going? Some wrote about pride. Others wrote about proving their worth. Many wrote about fighting not just for America, but for their families, for Harlem, for a country that might someday accept them fully. Music also sustained them. The Hellfighters band, led by the brilliant James Reese Europe, performed wherever they were stationed. The sound of early jazz drifted across bases, lifting spirits not just among black troops, but among French, British, and even Senegalese units. Their music became so popular that French civilians followed the band from town to town. They were ambassadors of culture, showing Europe a new sound that would one day change the world. As the war dragged toward its end, the Hellfighters were thrown into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American operation of the war. The fighting was relentless: thick forest, hidden machine guns, artillery barrages that shook bones. Units that advanced too fast found themselves cut off. Units that moved too slow were pulverized. The 369th? They kept moving forward. Shells exploded around them. Men were thrown through the air. Supply lines broke. Rations ran low. Still, they advanced. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the Hellfighters were still at the front. They had fought longer and harder than almost any American unit. 171 men received French honors. Entire companies were cited for bravery. But the greatest honor came later, in simple, quiet words spoken by French soldiers who had fought beside them. When the Americans wanted men who would not retreat, they sent the Hellfighters. Their return home should have been triumphant. But America wasn't ready to celebrate. Black heroes, what awaited them after the parade was heartbreak and a painful reminder that in 1919, courage on foreign soil did not erase racism at home. And their struggle after the war was a battle just as hard as anything they faced in France. And if their story had ended there, on that triumphant day in New York, perhaps America could have pretended that everything was fine, that a parade was enough, that applause could erase wounds deeper than shrapnel. But the truth is this: the real battle for the Harlem Hellfighters didn't end in Europe. It began the moment they stepped back onto American soil, when the drums stopped echoing and the flags were folded away. These men found themselves returning to a country facing one of the most racially explosive periods in its history, the summer of 1919. Historians today call it the Red Summer. Hundreds of racial assaults, riots, lynchings, and attacks on black communities across the nation. And the most shocking part? Many of the victims were black veterans. Men who had faced machine gun fire in France were beaten in the streets of cities like Chicago and Washington for wearing their uniforms. Their crime was simple: they walked too proudly. They stood too straight. They had seen a world where they were treated as equals, and they carried themselves like it. To extremist groups at the time, nothing was more threatening than a black man who had proven he could fight and win. And the Hellfighters, the most decorated black regiment in U.S. history, were among the most dangerous symbols of all. In Harlem, mothers who had proudly hung gold stars in their windows now feared the knock on the door, not from a military officer, but from someone offended that their son had survived the war. New York newspapers from that era are filled with stories of black veterans chased, beaten, arrested without reason. It makes what the Hellfighters achieved even more extraordinary, because instead of shrinking, Harlem grew louder. The 369th Regimental Band, led by James Reese Europe, had brought back something else from Europe besides bravery: jazz. Before the war, jazz was still considered too new, too wild, too different. But when Europeans heard it, real jazz, played by black musicians who lived and breathed every note, they fell in love instantly. Soldiers danced to it in muddy fields. Nurses listened to it between shell bursts. French civilians chased after the band just to hear one more song. Europe was hailed as a musical genius. His band didn't just entertain, they reshaped culture. In many ways, the Harlem Hellfighters didn't just fight a war, they exported the sound of America to the world. But shortly after returning home, tragedy struck. In May 1919, James Reese Europe was murdered by one of his own band members during a dispute. The news stunned the nation. Thousands attended his funeral, and he became the first African American ever honored with a public funeral in New York City. It was another reminder of how fragile post-war life had become for black veterans. They had faced German artillery, only to come home to a different kind of violence. Yet, despite the pain, the 369th refused to disappear. Many of the men continued serving in the National Guard, long before the U.S. Army officially allowed integrated units. Harlem kept their stories alive through parades, music, celebrations, and community pride. And one thing became clear over time: even if America tried to forget them, Europe never did. Decades later, French families whose grandparents had been liberated by the Hellfighters still told stories about the black soldiers who never retreated. Some villages kept newspaper clippings or photos passed down through generations. In France, the Hellfighters were remembered with respect, with gratitude, with something close to awe. The French army kept archives detailing every action of the 369th. Letters from French officers described them as extraordinary fighters, indefatigable, fearless under fire. Many French commanders admitted privately that without the Hellfighters, their lines might have collapsed during crucial battles. Back in America, however, official recognition moved slowly, painfully slowly. Henry Johnson remained the clearest symbol of that injustice. Before the war, he'd been a porter at the Albany train station. After the war, he could barely stand without pain. His ribs were damaged, his left foot shattered, his back permanently injured. He couldn't lift heavy objects, couldn't return to his old job, couldn't support his family. When he applied for disability benefits, documented, medical, undeniable, he was told his wounds were not service-related. But how could they not be service-related? He had 21 shrapnel wounds, bullet scars across his arm, knife scars across his torso. A German raiding party had literally tried to drag him away, but to grant him benefits would require acknowledging that black men fought and bled for their country. And in 1919, many officials simply weren't willing to do that. Johnson eventually turned to speaking publicly about how veterans were mistreated. He traveled, spoke at rallies, gave honest and painful accounts of what it meant to fight for a country that didn't fight for him. Some people applauded him. Others accused him of being unpatriotic. Still others tried to silence him. His health collapsed in the years that followed. He died at just 32 years old. No medals, no honors, no recognition. But history has a strange way of circling back. As decades passed, historians unearthed old military records, diaries, and forgotten reports. They discovered documents from France describing Johnson's battle in detail. Survivors from the 369th gave interviews. Family members preserved letters. Slowly, The truth became too large to ignore. In 1996, 77 years after the battle, President Bill Clinton awarded Henry Johnson the Purple Heart. In 2002, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. And finally, in 2015, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor in the United States. The medal he should have received in 1918. And when that medal was placed in the hands of his son, the moment was more than symbolic. It was America acknowledging, at last, what had always been true. Henry Johnson wasn't just a hero for Black Americans. He was an American hero. Full stop. Johnson's story reignited interest in the entire 369th. Families began coming forward with photos, sepia-toned group shots of young men smiling in uniforms too big for them. Museums collected rifles, medals, diaries. Schools added the Hellfighters to their curriculum. Veterans organizations honored them at ceremonies. Then, something even bigger happened. The U.S. Army officially reactivated the 369th Sustainment Brigade. The name Harlem Hellfighters, once unofficial, was formally recognized as part of their identity. What began as a segregated unit, denied basic respect, had become a modern, honored, integrated brigade carrying the same name that terrified German soldiers in 1918. And still, their legacy didn't stop. Hip-hop artists referenced them. Writers celebrated them. Hollywood began developing films about them. Comic book creators reimagined their battles in illustrated form. The Hellfighters became larger than life, not because someone invented myths about them, but because the truth was already unbelievable. But perhaps the deepest impact of all was on the future of the United States military. When World War II arrived, Black units again faced discrimination, but they also carried the Hellfighters' legacy with them. The Tuskegee Airmen, the Montford Point Marines, the 761st Tank Battalion, all of them fought under circumstances that were better than the Hellfighters faced, because the Hellfighters had already forced America to confront its own contradictions. By the time President Truman desegregated the military in 1948, the Harlem Hellfighters had become evidence undeniable, impossible to erase, that segregated assumptions about who could fight were fundamentally wrong. When modern soldiers look back today, they see the 369th as pioneers, trailblazers, men who changed the DNA of the U.S. Armed Forces through nothing more than courage, discipline, and relentless determination. And the most astonishing part? The Hellfighters weren't chosen because they were special. They became special because, when the world doubted them most, they refused to break. They were citizens who weren't treated like citizens. Patriots who weren't treated like patriots. Men who fought for a country that didn't always fight for them, and yet, they fought anyway. Their story is the kind of story America doesn't always tell about itself, but absolutely should. Because it shows something fundamental about what a nation can be, even when it isn't there yet. The Harlem Hellfighters didn't just prove their worth as soldiers. They proved the worth of ideals that America itself had failed to live up to. And that is why, more than a century later, their footsteps still echo from the muddy trenches of the Western Front to the streets of Harlem. From dusty archives to modern classrooms, from forgotten graves to newly polished medals, they marched into history carrying rifles and hope. And they marched through the present carrying something even stronger: the truth, the legacy, the unshakable proof that courage has no color.